Hey guys, it's Ken. So as you guys know that Ross and I buy a lot of land for apartments. We buy a lot of land for commercial development, doing self-storage, office buildings, apartments, even residential. So there's a lot of things that you need to know before you actually buy land. I see a lot of people buying land online without looking at it. So I'm going to go over 8 things that I think would be very important for you to ask or think about before you actually pull the trigger and actually buy the property. The first thing is terrain. So obviously to start purchasing land, it's not like purchasing a home off of Zillow. You need to physically look at the land so that you can see what it is that the land can be used for. Seeing the land in person is crucial because seeing a piece of land online will not tell you about the soil, the surrounding area, the topo, the terrain, or anything like that. It's really hard to see those things from an aerial standpoint, and usually most land is looked at from the top. Whatever you are looking to use the land for, you will have different criteria and different needs. So let me just tell you a couple things about terrain. If you buy a piece of land that has a big slope, you have to do what's called retaining walls all through the property. And so those retaining walls can be $200,000, $500,000, even $1 million, depending on what it is, to get the land buildable, to get it flat, because buildings have to be flat on a piece of land. So you can buy land super cheap with a big terrain, but it's going to be very costly to be able to build anything flat on it. So be very careful about the terrain. Hey guys, before I go any further, please hit the like button if you guys enjoy this. Floods are common and can be very expensive, and oftentimes you do not want land that are in flood zones. So there's different kinds of flood zones. And so you have to know exactly what kind of flood zone it is. So sometimes you can insure around it. Sometimes you won't even be able to build on it. Flood zones are determined by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Act. You can go online and check the different designations around flood zones. It basically says that those lands have a high risk of flooding, and the insurance company is going to have a problem with that, and your property could have a problem with that. Oftentimes, realtors do not know that there's flood zones on property. So you really need to make sure before you buy something that it doesn't have a flood zone. So let me tell you a little story about flood zones. So I have a friend that bought 15 acres with an old resort that he wanted to renovate and reopen. And it was 15 acres along this beautiful little creek called Oak Creek, which runs right through Sedona, Arizona. So he bought the land and he started to renovate the properties. And he started to fix all the units that needed to be fixed, and he wanted to open. And then what happened was the creek rose and flooded almost half of his property. What he forgot to check was that half the property was in a flood zone and therefore not buildable. So of the 15 acres, he only had a little over 7 that he could actually do anything on. So be very careful, because oftentimes you can buy a big piece of land and not be able to use it all. So if you guys like this, be sure and hit the link below and grab the show notes. We're going to have those available for you. The third thing is around utilities. So obviously, a big piece of vacant land out in the middle of the forest does not have utilities to it. So it can be very expensive getting power, water, cable, all of those things. And it has to come from somewhere. So it might have to come from a mile. It might have to come from 100 yards. It might be the contiguous property next to it. So bringing utilities to a piece of vacant land can be very, very, very expensive. So Ross and I have run into this before we buy apartment land. So oftentimes we'll buy land and then we have to run utilities to it. And sometimes it can be very costly, and sometimes it can be from a long way away. So be very careful. And so oftentimes when you see master plans, when you drive into a subdivision, for example, you'll have a residential lot. Well, that master developer has already put all the utilities in there. So you just have to put the house on it and then hook everything up. So the fourth thing is to look at what's actually physically on the property. Is it cleared? Does it have trees? Does it have rock outcroppings? There's all kinds of regulations around trees. Trees are protected in many, many, many areas. In one area, Flagstaff, Arizona, where we were going to build, we had a 15-acre property that we thought we were going to get 200 units on, and the city has an ordinance that actually protects the trees. They protect the tree groupings. And we had to get an aerial canopy cover to be able to group the trees around. And so the city was very specific on which trees we could take out and which trees we had to keep. And so what it did is it reduced the density or the number of units that we could actually get on that property. So when we thought we were going to get over 200 units, it ended up being closer to 100. And therefore, 100 units on 15 acres didn't make sense to buy the land. Additionally, treed land is expensive to clear, and there are a lot of regulations that make clearing expensive and very, very difficult. So when you're comparing purchase prices and you're looking at land, make sure that you're comparing treed land with treed land and cleared land with cleared land, and look at all the regulations that the city might have. You want to make sure that you understand the costs and the time frame of all those things before you buy it. Because if you don't have the city approvals and you buy the land, you might find that you might not be able to build exactly what it is that you thought you could when you originally purchased it. Number 5 is around access. While this seems extremely simple and not very complicated, you'd be surprised on how many people buy land and don't really understand how to get to it. There's no actual road or any way to actually get to the property. And sometimes you have an issue with that because it might be over a private road or there might be easements, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And so there's lots of things that you need to look at. Don't just go out and buy a piece of land until you really understand the access to that land. And make sure that you have all the approvals, like a county maintained road, so that you have access to that land, so that you can bring in things like your utilities, like your septic and your power and your water. All those things are going to be necessary and needed for whenever it is you decide to do whatever it is you decide to do on that land. So the 6th one is around a survey. You're going to want to make sure that you get a survey, because the survey basically tells you what you own. So what they do is they shoot it from a satellite and they actually show you the points of your land. On a number of situations, we found that we're encroaching on neighbors and neighbors are encroaching on us. And it can be very simple. It could be like a shed that was built in a corner where there's no fences. And so there's lots of reasons to make sure that you get a survey. You're going to want to know exactly what it is that you're going to buy. The 7th one is zoning. Now, the way a city master plans an area is they say, we want residential here, we want retail here, we want industrial here, we want open space here, we want parks here. And so they have different layers of zoning. So it's really important that you understand what the zoning is in your area. The zoning will restrict you on your height, your setbacks from the road, how much open space you need, all of those things. So zoning could be industrial, zoning could be multifamily, zoning can be residential, it can be retail. All of those things are really, really, really important. The easiest thing you can do is buy land that's already zoned for the use that you want. That's the easiest thing you can do. Those are easy. The harder thing to do is take a piece of land, let's say zoned for agriculture or ag, like a farm, and convert it to a mobile home park, or convert it to a retail center, or convert it to a multifamily. That requires a zoning attorney, and that requires often city and county approvals and can take a long time depending on where it is. So make sure that if you're going to buy a piece of land that's not zoned for what it is that you want it to be, that you do not purchase the property until it actually has the zoning approvals. Because once you own the property, you might not ever get those zoning approvals, and you might not ever change the zoning on that particular property. And then now you've bought a property that you can't produce what you wanted to produce on it. 8 is around easements. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard the word easements. So let's say I own a piece of land and somebody's driveway runs through it because it's landlocked. In other words, from the main road, there's a driveway that runs through my land so that they could get to their land. That's an easement. The utility companies also have easements. So the power lines and the water lines and the cable and all that kind of stuff can run through properties, and you'll find that those easements will be reflected on your survey. You'll actually be able to see those. So it's very important that you understand what those easements are. On a number of occasions, Ross and I will try to buy multifamily land, And the fire department, the utility companies, the setbacks, all those things, what they do is they take away from the area that you can build on. So typically you cannot build on an easement. So most people think of easements as driveways, but they can be all kinds of things. They can be fire lanes. They can be areas where the fire trucks need access. So those are all things that you have to consider. And what they do is they reduce the amount of use for a property that you might buy. So you really need to understand the different kinds of easements that exist before you actually buy a piece of land, because it could significantly reduce what you can do on that land after you own it.